At my granddaughter's wedding, I discovered exactly what my family thought I was worth. It wasn't love. It wasn't respect. It was a number printed on a small white card. I first noticed the name tag at the check-in table just outside the ballroom of the Arlington Grand Hotel. The young woman organizing the guest list smiled politely as she handed it to me. The same kind of smile people give when they're trying to be helpful without asking too many questions. I assumed it would say something simple, something appropriate. Margaret Whitmore, grandmother of the bride, that sort of thing. But when I looked down, I saw the words written in elegant black calligraphy. The old lady who's paying for everything. For a moment, I simply stared at it, waiting for my eyes to correct themselves. Weddings can be chaotic. Cards get mixed up. People make mistakes. That's what I told myself as the music from inside the ballroom drifted through the open doors and the scent of fresh roses filled the hallway. I let out a quiet breath and looked up at the young woman. She noticed my expression immediately. "Is something wrong, ma'am?" she asked gently. I forced a small smile. "There might be a mix-up with my name tag," I said. She leaned forward to read it, and her eyebrows lifted slightly, the way someone reacts when they see something unexpected but don't quite know how to explain it. "Oh, I'm sorry," she murmured. "Let me check if there's another one." I waved a hand lightly. "That's all right," I said. "I'm sure it's nothing." The truth was, I suddenly felt very aware of the dozens of guests moving through the entrance behind me. Expensive suits, satin dresses, laughter echoing down the marble hallway. I didn't want to cause a scene on Emily's wedding day. My granddaughter had spent a year planning this celebration. The venue alone probably cost more than my first house back in 1982. So I pinned the card to my pale blue dress, the one my late husband Robert always said made my eyes look brighter, and stepped into the ballroom. The room looked exactly like something out of a magazine. Crystal chandeliers hung from the high ceiling, reflecting warm light across rows of round tables covered in ivory linen. Each centerpiece was a tower of white roses and silver ribbons. A string quartet played softly near the dance floor. For a few seconds, everything felt perfect. My granddaughter Emily stood near the stage with her bridesmaids, glowing in a lace gown that caught the light every time she moved. She looked happy, truly happy, and that was all I had wanted when I wrote the first check to help pay for this wedding 6 months earlier. But as I walked deeper into the room, I began to notice something strange. A few guests glanced down at my chest. Some smiled awkwardly. One man chuckled under his breath before turning away. At first I thought I was imagining it. Then I heard a voice behind me whisper, "Did you see her name tag?" Another voice answered quietly, "Pamela said it would be funny." Pamela, my daughter-in-law. I felt something shift inside my chest then, not anger exactly, but the quiet realization that this wasn't a printing error. This was deliberate. Still, I kept walking. I greeted relatives. I complimented the decorations. I accepted a glass of sparkling water from a passing server. If anyone noticed the words pinned to my dress, I pretended not to see their reaction. After 67 years of life, you learn that sometimes the most powerful response is silence. And besides, I told myself calmly as I found my seat near the front of the room, if Pamela truly believed I was just the old lady paying for everything, then tonight she was about to learn how expensive that assumption could become. The seat assigned to me was near the front of the ballroom, just close enough to the stage that I could see every detail of the ceremony without needing my reading glasses. I lowered myself into the chair slowly, smoothing the fabric of my dress the way I always did when I felt the eyes of strangers nearby. The place card on the table read Margaret Whitmore in neat gold lettering, which felt oddly formal considering the small white label still pinned to my chest. Around me, guests continued arriving in waves of soft conversation and polite laughter. Waiters in black vests moved between tables carrying trays of sparkling water and champagne. Everything about the evening looked elegant and carefully planned. Yet every few minutes someone's gaze drifted downward toward my name tag, and their expression shifted just slightly before they looked away. A middle-aged couple, seated at the next table, leaned toward each other in quiet conversation. I did not intend to listen, but the room was filled with the kind of gentle music that allows whispers to travel farther than people expect. The woman glanced at me briefly and said under her breath, "I heard she covered almost the entire bill." The man responded with a low chuckle and said, "Well, that explains the joke." I lifted my glass and took a small sip of water, letting the coolness settle in my throat while I pretended not to hear them. After a moment, the woman noticed me watching the dance floor and offered a polite smile. "Beautiful wedding," she said. "Yes, it is," I replied calmly. "My granddaughter deserves a lovely beginning." She nodded and looked slightly embarrassed, as though she suspected I had heard more of their conversation than she intended. Across the room, I spotted my son Daniel speaking with several guests near the bar. He looked confident in his charcoal suit, gesturing with the relaxed ease of someone hosting an important event. Pamela stood beside him in a silver dress that caught the chandelier light each time she turned. She laughed at something one of the guests said, then leaned close to whisper something into Daniel's ear. For a moment, Daniel glanced across the room toward me. Our eyes met briefly. He gave a small nod, the kind people exchange with acquaintances rather than family. Then he turned back to his conversation. I studied the two of them quietly. Pamela had always been charming in public. That was one of the reasons Daniel fell in love with her 15 years ago. She knew how to make people feel included while guiding every conversation in the direction she preferred. At first, I had admired that skill. Later, I began to recognize it for what it truly was. The string quartet shifted into a softer melody as guests settled into their seats. Near the entrance, Emily appeared with her bridal party, glowing with excitement and nerves the way brides always do. Several people stood to take photographs. Cameras flashed gently across the ballroom. I felt genuine warmth watching her laugh with her friends. Emily had always been kind to me. When she was 8 years old, she used to sit at my kitchen table on Sunday afternoons while we baked cinnamon rolls together. Back then, she would tell everyone that Grandma Margaret made the best desserts in the world. I wondered briefly if she had seen the name tag yet. Perhaps she had not noticed. Or perhaps she believed it was harmless humor. Weddings have a way of blurring small cruelties into the background noise of celebration. A few minutes later, a man in a navy suit approached my table. I recognized him as one of Robert's former business associates, someone I had met years earlier at a charity dinner. "Margaret," he said warmly, extending his hand. "It has been a long time." "It has indeed," I answered, shaking his hand politely. He hesitated for a second, his eyes drifting toward the words on my chest. I saw the moment he read them. His expression shifted into something uncomfortable. "That is quite a label they gave you tonight," he said carefully. I gave a small smile. "Yes, well, families can have a curious sense of humor." He studied me for a moment longer, as though trying to determine whether I was truly amused or simply being polite. Then he lowered his voice slightly and said, "Your husband Robert always admired your patience." I suspect he knew exactly why. I thanked him softly, but his comment stayed with me after he returned to his table. Robert had understood people very well. In business, he used to say that money rarely changes someone's character. It simply reveals what was already there. I folded my hands in my lap and listened as the officiant stepped onto the stage to welcome the guests. The room grew quiet as the ceremony began. While everyone focused on the bride walking down the aisle, I felt the weight of that small card pinned to my dress. The words were simple, almost playful on the surface, yet they had been placed there with intention. And intention, I had learned over many years of marriage and family life, always tells a deeper story than the joke itself. The ceremony moved forward with the calm rhythm that weddings often have, the kind of gentle pacing that allows people to relax and forget about everything outside the room. Emily walked slowly down the aisle with Daniel beside her, her arm tucked through his in that careful way brides practice for weeks before the big day. The chandeliers above us reflected soft light across the polished floor, and the music from the string quartet floated quietly through the air. From a distance, it must have looked like a perfect evening. Guests smiled. Phones lifted to capture photographs. Someone behind me whispered how beautiful the bride looked. I watched it all with steady attention, but every now and then I still felt someone's eyes drift toward the small card pinned to my dress. The words had not changed, yet the longer they remained there, the more clearly I began to understand the story they were meant to tell. It was not really about humor. It was about a reputation that had been carefully prepared long before this evening began. When the officiant asked everyone to stand for the vows, the room shifted with the sound of chairs sliding back across the carpet. I stood with the others, folding my hands together while Emily and her fiancé faced each other beneath a white arch covered in roses. Their voices were soft but sincere. They promised patience, kindness, and partnership. I believed Emily meant every word. She had always been earnest, even as a little girl. For a moment, I allowed myself to focus entirely on her happiness. The ceremony ended with applause and cheerful laughter. Music rose again as the couple kissed and walked back down the aisle together. People turned toward the reception tables where dinner would soon be served. A waiter passed with a tray of champagne glasses, and I accepted one politely. The bubbles shimmered under the chandelier light. I lifted the glass slightly toward Emily as she passed by greeting guests. She smiled at me warmly and squeezed my hand for a second before moving along to the next group of relatives. That brief moment reassured me that whatever was happening around this celebration did not come from her heart. As the room shifted into the easy noise of conversation again, I heard another exchange from a nearby table. A man said quietly, "I heard Pamela told everyone Margaret insisted on covering the big expenses herself." His companion answered, "Well, that explains the little joke they gave her." I kept my expression neutral and took another sip of champagne. The flavor was crisp and dry, the kind Robert used to prefer on special occasions. I found myself thinking of him again, remembering the way he used to watch rooms like this with careful attention. Robert believed celebrations revealed people more clearly than ordinary days. When people felt comfortable, when they believed they were surrounded by friends, their true assumptions often slipped into the open without effort. I glanced across the ballroom once more toward Daniel and Pamela. They were greeting guests at the edge of the dance floor, thanking people for coming, accepting compliments about the decorations and the music. Pamela's laughter carried easily through the room. Every few minutes someone leaned toward her and said something that made her smile even wider. I could not hear every word, but I noticed several glances directed toward me during those conversations. Each time Pamela responded with a small shrug and an amused expression, as if confirming a harmless joke everyone was already supposed to understand. That was when the last piece of the pattern finally settled into place in my mind. This was not a spontaneous prank created by a careless event planner. This was a story that had been shared quietly among the guests before the evening began, a narrative in which I appeared as the wealthy grandmother, happily paying for everything while everyone else laughed at the label. I rested the champagne glass carefully on the table and straightened the edge of my napkin. After so many years of family gatherings and financial help, I recognized the tone of that story very well. It was the voice people use when they believe generosity will always arrive without questions. And as I watched Daniel and Pamela continue greeting their guests, I realized that tonight might be the first time they had ever considered what might happen if that assumption turned out to be wrong. For the rest of the evening, I watched the celebration the way Robert used to watch business meetings, quietly, patiently, noticing the small details most people missed. Dinner began with polite applause as the catering staff moved gracefully between the tables, placing white plates filled with roasted chicken, seasonal vegetables, and small buttered potatoes in front of each guest. The scent of rosemary and warm bread drifted through the ballroom, mixing with the soft hum of conversation. People complimented the food, raised glasses of wine, and spoke about how wonderful the wedding looked. From the outside, it was everything a family gathering should be. Yet every now and then someone glanced toward me and smiled in that same curious way, the expression people wear when they believe they are sharing an inside joke. I lowered my napkin onto my lap and let my thoughts drift backward through the past several years, because once the pattern reveals itself, the earlier moments begin lining up with surprising clarity. The first time Daniel and Pamela asked for financial help had been shortly after they purchased their home in Arlington Heights. They said the kitchen needed renovations, nothing extravagant, just modern appliances and new cabinets so the house would feel more welcoming for family dinners. I remember Pamela sitting across from me at my kitchen table with a notebook open, explaining how the project would cost about $25,000. She spoke carefully, emphasizing that they would never ask if it was not important for the family. I wrote the check that afternoon because I believed supporting family meant helping them build a stable life. A year later, Emily began applying to colleges. Tuition numbers today can surprise anyone who graduated decades earlier, and Daniel admitted that the expenses were more than they expected. Pamela assured me it would only be temporary assistance until scholarships and loans covered the rest. I wrote another check then as well, nearly $40,000 spread across several semesters, because education felt like the kind of investment Robert would have approved without hesitation. Then came the wedding planning last winter. Pamela called one evening sounding excited but slightly overwhelmed. Venues were expensive, she explained, and Emily deserved something memorable after working so hard in school. She described the Arlington Grand Hotel with its high ceilings and elegant ballroom, the kind of place people remember for years. I could still hear her voice clearly as she said, "Margaret, you are the heart of this family, and Emily would be so grateful if you helped make her dream wedding possible." At the time, I believed the words were sincere. Robert had always taken pride in providing for the people he loved, and after he passed away 3 years ago, I felt it was my responsibility to continue that tradition in my own quiet way. Looking around the ballroom now, I could see exactly where those contributions had gone. The crystal centerpieces, the orchestra, the elaborate floral arch near the stage. It was all beautiful, and I did not regret helping my granddaughter celebrate such an important moment. What I found interesting, however, was the way generosity had gradually been transformed into expectation. At some point between the kitchen renovation and tonight's reception, the idea of assistance had quietly shifted into the assumption that my role was simply to fund whatever the family desired. Robert used to say that money does not change people. It reveals the habits they already carry inside them. As I watched Daniel and Pamela moving through the room thanking guests and accepting compliments, I realized that tonight's little name tag joke was not meant to embarrass me as much as it was meant to confirm something they believed everyone already understood. In their version of the story, I was the comfortable grandmother who happily paid the bills while the younger generation enjoyed the celebration. And perhaps they believed I would smile politely and continue playing that role forever. I folded my hands together on the table and allowed myself a small, thoughtful breath. Robert had also taught me something else during our 42 years of marriage. When people grow comfortable with a pattern, they rarely notice the moment when that pattern quietly changes. After dinner, the lights dimmed slightly, and the band began playing a soft instrumental version of an old jazz standard Robert used to enjoy. Guests pushed their chairs back and drifted toward the dance floor, some laughing as they adjusted their jackets or smoothed their dresses before joining the newly married couple for the first dance. Emily and her husband stepped into the center of the room, while everyone gathered around them in a loose circle of smiling faces. I watched as my granddaughter rested her head lightly against her husband's shoulder, the long lace train of her gown trailing across the polished floor like a quiet ripple of white water. It was a lovely moment, the kind of memory families talk about years later. I felt proud of her, truly proud, and for a moment the noise of the evening softened enough that I could simply enjoy watching her happiness unfold. When the music ended, applause filled the ballroom and the guests slowly returned to their tables. I remained seated for a moment, allowing the energy of the room to settle. That was when a familiar voice spoke quietly beside me. "Margaret, I thought that might be you." I turned to see Robert Greene standing near the edge of the table. He looked almost exactly as I remembered him, though his hair had grown thinner and more silver since the last time we spoke. Robert Greene had been Robert Whitmore's attorney for nearly 20 years and had attended more than a few of our family gatherings back when my husband was alive. "Mr. Greene," I said with a small smile, "it has been a long time." He nodded warmly and took the empty seat beside me. "It certainly has. Your husband would have enjoyed seeing this place tonight." Robert always appreciated a good celebration. I followed his gaze toward the dance floor where guests were beginning to form small groups again, laughing and sharing stories over glasses of wine. "Yes, he did," I replied softly. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then Mr. Greene's eyes shifted downward to the card pinned neatly to my dress. I saw the exact moment he read the words printed on it. His expression did not change dramatically, but a quiet seriousness settled into his face. "Margaret," he said carefully, "I hope you will forgive me for asking something direct. Did you agree to wear that label?" I let out a small breath that was almost a laugh. "No," I said calmly. "That particular idea was not mine." He studied my face for a moment, the way attorneys do when they are measuring more than just the words spoken. Then he nodded slowly. "I suspected as much. Robert always warned me that your patience would one day be tested by the people closest to you." I looked at him with curiosity. That sounds like something he would say. Mr. Greene leaned slightly closer and lowered his voice so that the nearby guests could not hear. "Before your husband passed away, he asked me to prepare several documents that were not included in the main reading of his will. Nothing dramatic, he told me, but certain protections in case generosity was ever mistaken for obligation." I felt a quiet stillness settle in my chest. Robert had always been thoughtful when it came to planning for the future, but he rarely spoke about legal details unless they were absolutely necessary. Mr. Green continued speaking in that same calm tone. Your husband believed that respect inside a family should never be purchased. He wanted to ensure that if anyone in the family publicly humiliated you because of money, certain financial arrangements would immediately change. I folded my hands together on the table as the meaning of his words slowly became clear. Across the room, Daniel and Pamela were still moving from table to table, greeting guests and accepting congratulations. They looked relaxed, confident, completely certain that the evening was unfolding exactly the way they expected. Mr. Green followed my gaze toward them and then looked back at me. I have not mentioned these provisions to anyone else, he said quietly. Your husband believed you would know when the right moment arrived. For the first time that evening, I felt the faintest trace of something that might have been amusement. Robert had always trusted my judgment, even when others underestimated it. I looked down once more at the small white card attached to my dress, the words still sitting there, as if they were a harmless joke meant to entertain the room. Then I lifted my eyes again toward the dance floor where my son and daughter-in-law continued smiling for their guests. Perhaps, I thought calmly, the right moment had been sitting quietly in front of me all evening. For the next several minutes I remained seated beside Robert Green, watching the room with the same calm patience my husband had once used during long negotiations. The band had shifted to livelier music now, and more guests were gathering on the dance floor. Laughter echoed against the tall ceilings while waiters moved gracefully between tables carrying trays of desserts and coffee. From a distance, everything looked joyful, exactly the way a wedding reception is supposed to feel. Yet inside my mind the evening had quietly changed shape. The small card on my dress no longer felt like an embarrassment. It felt like evidence. I lifted my hand and lightly touched the edge of the tag, as if making sure it was still there. The words remained clear and unmistakable. The old lady who is paying for everything. Robert Green noticed the gesture and gave a thoughtful nod. Your husband believed people reveal their intentions most clearly when they believe no one is paying attention, he said quietly. I smiled faintly. That sounds like Robert. Across the ballroom, Daniel raised a glass while speaking with a group of guests near the bar. Pamela stood beside him, radiant in the warm light of the chandeliers, greeting relatives and friends as if the entire evening had unfolded perfectly. Every few minutes someone laughed at something she said, and once again I noticed several glances drifting toward me. Pamela followed those glances with a playful smile, the kind of expression that suggests a harmless joke shared among friends. I could almost imagine the story she had told them earlier in the evening. Margaret insisted on paying for everything. Margaret would not let anyone else contribute. Margaret loves being generous. The version of me she described was comfortable, predictable, and very useful. Robert Green folded his hands together on the table. Margaret, he said in the calm voice lawyers use when they want every word to be heard clearly, the documents your husband prepared are not something I reveal without reason. They exist for moments exactly like this one. I looked at him thoughtfully. And what exactly happens if that moment arrives? He did not answer immediately. Instead, he reached inside his jacket and removed a slim envelope, placing it carefully on the table between us. Your husband believed that dignity should never be traded for convenience, he said. If anyone in the family publicly humiliates you in connection with money, certain assets he left behind automatically change ownership and control. The process is immediate. I glanced down at the envelope but did not open it. I did not need to read the legal language to understand Robert's intention. My husband had always been protective in quiet ways that people rarely noticed. The music grew louder as the band encouraged more guests to join the dancing. Near the center of the floor, Emily was laughing while her friends spun her in a loose circle of celebration. I watched her for a moment and felt a warm sense of pride. None of this situation belonged to her. She deserved to remember this night for its happiness, not for the quiet tension unfolding around the edges of the room. Robert Green leaned slightly closer. The decision is entirely yours, Margaret. Your husband trusted you to know when generosity had been mistaken for weakness. I lifted my eyes again toward Daniel and Pamela. They looked confident, relaxed, completely unaware that the story they had written for the evening might soon change direction. I reached up and unpinned the small card from my dress, holding it between my fingers for a moment before placing it gently on the table beside the unopened envelope. Then I folded my hands together once more and watched the celebration continue, knowing that sometimes the most powerful response is not anger or confrontation but patience. After all, the evening was not over yet, and people who believe they understand the ending of a story rarely notice when a different ending has already begun. The music grew louder as the evening moved deeper into celebration. More guests filled the dance floor while others returned to their tables carrying small plates of cake and glasses of wine. Laughter rolled across the ballroom in gentle waves, the kind that makes a room feel warm and relaxed. I remained seated for a few minutes longer beside Robert Greene, watching the rhythm of the reception unfold. The small card now rested quietly on the table in front of me next to the unopened envelope he had placed there earlier. Without the tag on my dress, no one seemed quite as interested in looking my direction anymore. It was a curious thing how quickly attention fades once the object of the joke disappears. Robert Greene noticed my gaze resting on the envelope. "Your husband always believed that patience reveals more truth than confrontation," he said calmly. I nodded once. Robert believed many things that turned out to be correct. Across the ballroom, the master of ceremonies tapped the microphone lightly and asked everyone to return to their seats for a few speeches before the dancing continued. Chairs slid back across the carpet, and the hum of conversation softened as guests settled again at their tables. Daniel stepped toward the stage first, straightening his jacket as he accepted the microphone. My son had always been comfortable speaking in front of a crowd. Even when he was a boy, he enjoyed being the center of attention during family gatherings. He cleared his throat and smiled warmly at the room. "Thank you all for being here tonight to celebrate Emily and the beginning of this wonderful new chapter in her life," he began. His voice carried easily through the speakers, confident and polished. He spoke about Emily's childhood, about the pride he felt watching her grow into a capable young woman, and about how happy he was to welcome her husband into the family. The guests listened politely, occasionally laughing at small stories he shared from her younger years. When Daniel finished, Pamela stepped forward beside him to take the microphone. She thanked everyone again for traveling to the wedding and for supporting the couple. Then she paused briefly and glanced across the room. Her eyes found me immediately. A playful smile appeared on her face as she lifted the microphone again. "Of course," she said with a light laugh. "None of this would have been possible without a very special person in the room tonight." Several guests turned their heads instinctively, following her gaze toward my table. Pamela gestured gracefully in my direction. "Margaret has always loved taking care of the family," she continued. "In fact, we like to joke that tonight's celebration is brought to you by the most generous grandmother in the world." A ripple of amused laughter moved through the room. I noticed several people glance again at my chest, as if expecting to see the little card still pinned there. When they realized it was gone, a few exchanged puzzled looks. Pamela continued smiling, apparently unaware that the prop supporting her joke was no longer part of the scene. I folded my hands quietly on the table and looked toward Robert Greene. He gave me a subtle nod, the kind that carries more meaning than words. The envelope still rested between us, untouched. On stage, Pamela finished her short speech and lifted a glass of champagne. "Let us all raise a toast to Emily and her wonderful future," she said brightly. Glasses lifted around the room. I rose slowly from my chair as well, lifting my own glass with calm steadiness. From across the ballroom, Daniel noticed me standing and offered a small approving smile, clearly believing that the evening had unfolded exactly as he and Pamela had planned. For a moment, I allowed the quiet noise of celebration to fill the room again. Then I turned slightly toward Robert Greene and gently placed my hand on the envelope beside me. Some stories, I reflected silently, only appear predictable until someone decides to open the next page. The room remained filled with raised glasses and cheerful applause as Pamela finished her toast, completely certain that the evening had unfolded exactly the way she expected. Around the ballroom, guests smiled politely, some still glancing toward my table as if waiting for me to laugh along with the joke that had followed me through the night. I remained standing with my glass in my hand for a moment longer, letting the quiet hum of celebration settle across the room. Then I slowly placed the glass back on the table and picked up the envelope Robert Greene had placed there earlier. The movement was small, but it caught his attention immediately. He watched me carefully as I opened the flap and removed the document inside. The paper was thick and official, the kind of document Robert had always insisted upon when important decisions were involved. Robert Greene rose calmly from his chair and adjusted his jacket before stepping toward the stage. His movement alone drew a few curious looks from nearby tables. When he reached the microphone stand beside Pamela, he offered her a polite nod and spoke in the steady voice that had served him well during decades in courtrooms and boardrooms. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "I apologize for the brief interruption. My name is Robert Greene. I was the legal counsel for the late Robert Whitmore." The room grew noticeably quieter as guests turned toward the stage with curious expressions. Daniel's smile faded slightly as he recognized the name. Pamela stepped back from the microphone, clearly surprised but still attempting to maintain her confident composure. Mr. Greene continued speaking calmly. Before his passing 3 years ago, Mr. Whitmore prepared several legal provisions regarding the management and future ownership of certain family assets. These provisions include a clause designed specifically to protect the dignity and financial independence of his wife, Margaret Whitmore. A soft murmur moved through the room as people began to sense that the evening was shifting in a direction they had not expected. Robert Greene unfolded the document and continued. According to this legally binding clause, if any family member publicly humiliates Margaret Whitmore in connection with financial contributions or inheritance, the distribution of several key assets is automatically modified. The control of those assets transfers immediately and permanently. I watched Daniel carefully as the meaning of those words reached him. The confident expression he had worn throughout the evening slowly tightened into confusion. Pamela looked from the lawyer to me and back again, clearly trying to understand how the comfortable story she had been telling all night had suddenly taken a different shape. Robert Greene continued in the same calm tone. The clause further specifies that the individual responsible for such humiliation forfeits any future claim to the Whitmore estate, including investment accounts, property holdings, and business shares originally designated to them. A few guests exchanged quiet glances while others simply stared in stunned silence. The ballroom that had been filled with laughter only minutes earlier now felt still and attentive. I remained beside my table, watching everything with the same quiet patience Robert had always admired. Finally, Mr. Greene lowered the document and concluded. Based on the events that occurred during tonight's reception, the clause has now been activated. Effective immediately, the inheritance previously allocated to Daniel Whitmore and Pamela Whitmore has been revoked and reassigned according to the alternative structure established by Mr. Whitmore. The silence that followed was deeper than anything the room had experienced all evening. Daniel stood motionless near the stage, clearly struggling to process what had just happened. Pamela's expression had changed completely, the confident smile replaced by a stunned stillness. I simply reached for my glass again and took a calm sip of water, remembering something Robert once said during a quiet evening at home. Respect, he had told me, is not something you demand loudly. It is something people learn to offer when they finally understand the cost of taking it for granted. The silence in the ballroom lingered longer than anyone expected. For several seconds no one moved, no one spoke, and the music that had filled the room earlier felt like a distant memory. Guests sat quietly at their tables, looking between Daniel, Pamela, and the document still resting in Robert Greene's hands. The atmosphere had shifted completely, not with shouting or chaos, but with the quiet weight of understanding settling across the room. Daniel was the first to move. He stepped closer to the microphone, his expression caught somewhere between confusion and disbelief. His voice, when he finally spoke, was noticeably different from the confident tone he had used earlier in the evening. "Mom," he said slowly, looking toward me across the room, "I think there must be some misunderstanding." I met his gaze calmly, but did not answer immediately. Pamela stood beside him, her posture rigid, her earlier confidence replaced by a careful attempt to recover control of the moment. She leaned toward the microphone as well. "This is supposed to be Emily's wedding night," she said quickly. "I am sure everyone can see that this is simply a misunderstanding of a joke." Several guests shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. The word joke seemed to hang awkwardly in the air. Robert Greene remained standing beside the stage, composed and professional. "There is no misunderstanding," he said gently but firmly. "The document I read is legally binding and was prepared with very specific language by Robert Whitmore himself. The clause activates when a public statement or action humiliates Margaret Whitmore in connection with financial contributions. Pamela opened her mouth as if preparing to argue further, but no words came out. Around the room, the guests had begun to understand the situation clearly. A few people looked down at their glasses while others glanced toward me with expressions of sympathy or quiet respect. I slowly rose from my chair. The movement was unhurried, almost ordinary, yet it seemed to draw the attention of the entire ballroom. As I walked toward the stage, the sound of my footsteps on the carpet was nearly silent. When I reached Daniel and Pamela, I paused for a moment before speaking. My voice was calm, steady, the way it had always been when my family needed reassurance. "Daniel," I said softly, "this evening was never about money." I looked briefly toward Emily, who stood near the dance floor holding her husband's hand, her eyes wide with concern but also with understanding. "Your grandfather loved this family very much," I continued. "That is why he believed respect should always come before generosity." Daniel lowered his eyes for a moment, the realization settling slowly across his face. Pamela looked away toward the guests, clearly aware that the comfortable story she had created earlier had quietly unraveled in front of everyone. I did not raise my voice or accuse anyone. Instead, I simply placed the small white name card on the edge of the stage where everyone could see it. The words printed on it were still perfectly clear under the chandelier lights. "The old lady who is paying for everything." For a moment, the room remained silent again. Then I spoke one final sentence, not with anger, but with quiet clarity. "Generosity is a gift," I said, "not a role someone is assigned." After that, I stepped away from the microphone and walked slowly back toward my table. Robert Greene folded the document carefully and returned it to the envelope. The band members looked uncertain for a moment before beginning a soft instrumental piece, allowing the celebration to continue. Across the ballroom, Emily approached me and wrapped her arms around me gently, whispering thank you in a voice only I could hear. I smiled and rested my hand lightly on her shoulder. The evening had changed, certainly, but not everything had been lost. As Robert used to remind me during long, quiet conversations at home, sometimes the most important lessons in a family are not the ones spoken loudly. They are the ones everyone remembers long after the music fades.